who shed light on various contemporary issues surrounding the regime of international law. Over the past 3 days, we had extremely engaging and interactive sessions on various themes. First one being the legality of actions by Iran and US in the killing of General Soleimani. And then the second one was the crisis of the WTO dispute settlement body. And the last one was regarding the art of lecturing and research skills. Today we have the final session on prevention of biological warfare. And I would like to invite Professor Ahuja to shed light on a little bit on Samvad 2020 in today's session.
Thank you, Manmeet. A very good morning to all of you. We have the last lecture of Professor V.P. Nanda series, and I'm extremely happy that Professor V.P. Nanda was so kind that he accepted my invitation, and we are extremely lucky that we have hosted Professor V.P. Nanda, a distinguished professor at the University of Trento. When I was making the schedule, so the themes were there in my mind. So as I told you in the previous lectures also, it ranged from public international law to international trade to research skills, and today it is the humanitarian law. The reason why I selected this theme was that because of this coronavirus in China, according to unofficial report, more than 25,000 have died. There are 1.56 lakh people who are affected by this particular virus. And you can see that there have been deaths in some other countries also. And even in India, we have 3 cases where the patients have been tested as positive in Kerala. There are patients in United Kingdom, in America also, and in several other countries. Now, somewhere a question comes to mind: what exactly had happened here? Because if you just make a comparison with other viruses, like there was one table, very good table, where they have talked about swine flu, how many people were killed, and Ebola was there, and now this corona is there. So what is happening is that somewhere something has gone wrong. In one of the reports which I read in the Times of India, it was that China had admitted that this virus had come from their lab. Now imagine one thing: if suppose this kind of a virus has been sent somehow through a device or through a bomb or whatever it is on a particular country, you need not kill people by guns. You are not supposed to drop arms and ammunition there. You are not going to do the bombardment of that particular country. So even if this virus has been sent there somehow, and which is going to affect a lot of people, and it is spreading actually. So the people will die out of it, and there will be no loss of property as such, but then there will be a loss to the human beings, and there will be a lot of human sufferings also. As the International Law Service going to tell you, the 3 types of weapons: the nuclear weapons, the chemical weapons, and the biological warfare, the biological weapons. They are prohibited as per humanitarian law to be used during wars. So this is one of the 3, because you might have read something about nuclear warfare. There are advisory opinions also in your syllabus also, but we hardly make any reference to the weapons of biological warfare. So that is why I thought that let us have an expert here on this particular topic. So sir is going to enlighten us on the prevention of the manufacturing as well as use of the biological weapons. Thank you very much.
Good morning. Wonderful to be with you again. And this is the last one of the lectures, and Dr. Ahuja kept the last one that is not very pleasant to talk about, and it's a virus. You probably have seen Dr. Ahuja said about the numbers, and he's right. WHO, the World Health Organization, has said that there are 28,000 right now cases, 565 deaths, and it's almost 30 countries. India has 3, United States has 12, Hong Kong, Macau, those very close to China, they have got many more. And at the present time, you probably know, there are 50 million people that have not been permitted to leave their homes, and they are at the present time isolated. So that is the kind of setting. And what is it? When you think about that virus, then you think of 2 others that you might have read about them. In the early 2000s, 2002, you had heard about SARS, S-A-R-S. How many of you heard about SARS? All of you. And how many of you know what SARS means? What does it stand for? Wonderful. And they'll tell you that it is severe, it's acute, and respiratory syndrome. And many of you know that it also had happened in the Middle East. And how many of you know that? So it was Middle East also, the same kind of thing, Middle East, and it was that syndrome again, respiratory, and it's respiratory things because you get pneumonia, you got cough, and usually what they say that it comes from animals, and also it can come from a lab. But in this case, they were not quite sure where it came from. But in Wuhan, there is a market, and that market is seafood market. But in that market, they feel that maybe it came initially, they were thinking about snakes, because in that market there are all kind of animals. And then they thought it came from a bat. And that from bat or snake or whatever else, that it came from animal to a human. And then the World Health Organization said, it's now from human to human. If you look back at SARS, there are now 8,000 people affected. And there are almost 800 of them who died. In the Middle East respiratory syndrome, there were 2,500 people that were affected, and the casualty rate, the lethal impact of that was enormous, almost 35%. Because out of those 2,500, almost 800 of them died. Those who know about history, and I won't take you into any details, I won't take you into any technical issues, but a simple kind of way of looking at this biological warfare and where it stands at the present time and how possibly it can be prevented. Many of you also probably know that many years ago, 1925, at that time the very first attempt was made that we should have some kind of a treaty, some kind of a protocol in order to prevent, in order to see that countries take steps, and it was about the use, that biological, chemical weapons cannot be used. But that treaty at that time did not talk about development, did not talk about stockpiling. And so the effort was made in 1972 in order to do that. I thought I would simply mention to you, don't go back into history a whole lot, because it goes back to Assyrians, and that is thousands of years ago. then it came, the British used it against the Native Americans, and that was in the 18th century. And then actually the Second World War, where you can see a whole lot of this kind of attempt used, that was the Japanese. And they were masters in using it. They killed so many people. So plague, smallpox, all those kind of efforts have been done. I thought I would give you very simple definition of this, and this is from the United States. We've got the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, CDC centers. They are in Atlanta, and it says that bioterrorism, and it defines it. And the definition is the international release of viruses, bacteria, or other germs that can sicken or kill people, livestock, crops. It can be done through aerosol spray. It can be done through explosive devices. It can be done through food, water, or absorbed or injected into skin. So today what has happened is that it's very economical to make it. Technology is very easy. It's not simply that countries can use it, but non-state actors, terrorists can use it. Anybody can make it. And so what has happened today is that when you think about this virus, and this coronavirus, as I mentioned, similarly had happened in SARS, in MERS, but today it's a novel one. They hadn't seen it before, and so that was the unknown. You probably also might have seen in today's papers or heard about it, that the first doctor who had blown the whistle, who had in December found out that perhaps there is this kind of virus spreading, likely to spread, and he had called it to the attention of the Chinese authorities. What they did was, they detained him. They said to him that he was simply trying to create anarchy, trying to create unrest, and they criticized him. That poor guy has died. The very first guy who blew the whistle. And today, obviously, they are saying that he is a hero. What has happened this time, unlike SARS though, is that the Chinese have come forward. There is much more transparency than it was earlier, and there is a great deal of international cooperation. Chinese have not covered it up for a long period of time. Initially, they did want to do that, but then after that, middle December, later on, they came out, they said that we have got this problem, and now they are sharing the news. So that is the kind of setting at the present time. Well, what is the problem that we see in bioterrorism? And again, to put it in a very simple terms, that there is easy access today to a wide range of disease-producing biological agents. There is low cost for producing it. At the same time, you cannot detect it very easily. And the routine security systems are unable at times to detect it. And it can be easily transported and from one to the other areas, geographical and others. And if you really want to know what this germ warfare is, in simple terms, it is the use of biological toxins or infectious agents, bacteria, viruses, fungi, and then you can kill, you can incapacitate humans, animals, or plants. also, along with that, even the insects can be used for this kind of thing. And there are two things. Either you can see that they reproduce, these are living organisms, or they are replicating viruses, entities. So either reproduce or replicate. So that is the kind of thing that you find at the present time happening. I think the problems that I wanted to mention to you, that because 1925, that treaty did not go to production, did not go to stockpiling, then in 1972, the treaty on biological warfare weapons did become a reality. 1975, 3 years later, it became effective, and today there are 183 countries. As of last August, when I checked, 183 countries that are party to it. There are at the present time almost 10 that have not ratified it, that have not been signed it. And there are 5 countries at the present time, they are in the process of ratification. Most of you know how a treaty is drafted, a treaty becomes ratified, right? How many of you know how a treaty becomes a treaty? You have an international agreement. How does it happen? Very briefly at the end, to remind you, refresh your memory, that what happens in a treaty is that the executive, the Prime Minister, the President, in almost all countries, executive is the one that negotiates the treaty. So meaning thereby that they are the ones who probably have a group of people designated to go and work on negotiation, drafting. And these people, they have got close relationship with their own capitals, with their own country, with their own executives, Department of Justice or Department of Foreign Affairs or Department of Law. But they are the ones that get from their own capitals, from their own countries, instructions. And negotiations take place. A treaty is drafted, then they sign that treaty. And signing the treaty does not mean that you are bound by it. What it simply means is that you are not going to oppose it, you are not going to violate it. And then the treaty comes back, and in almost all instances, it's the legislature, the Lok Sabha, Congresses, parliaments, that have got to, under their own processes. For example, in the United States, it's only the Senate, that is your Rajya Sabha. And it can ratify it by 2/3 majority. And once they have done it, then the President is the one in the United States that put his signature on it. And hopefully one of them, it will be she. We have had no woman president until now, and I hope that soon we'll have one. But then that president signs it, and then it becomes a treaty. So this treaty today does go to development, it goes to stockpiling, and today you have every opportunity to make sure that these development, stockpiling, use, all of that is prohibited. But the problem with this treaty is that there is no monitoring, there is no verification, there is no enforcement. It is left to each country. And the countries are the ones that have got to give a report. And then in this treaty, what happens is that every 5 years they review it. They have added things to it, they have refined it, they have modified it, and the effort is in order to see that we prevent the use of these bioweapons. But prevention is very hard, because I mentioned to you three things. It's very economical to produce it. New technologies have come. For example, you've got at the present time gene editing, and that really makes it very, very hard. Then there are improved delivery systems. You have got synthetic biology. Dr. Ahuja mentioned about ILAB. So all that adds to the complexity of it. And so it is that easy. How do you prevent it? Because as I mentioned to you, smallpox, plague. And it's not only nation states that can use them in a strategic way, but what happens is that non-state actors, terrorists, and individuals, not for a strategic purpose, but for tactical purposes. Terrorists can use it in order to blackmail all kinds of problems. And so, how do you prevent it? And I looked at the possibilities, and the possibilities there also are not endless, but you can do some things that would help. The United States has its own policies and recommendations to the US as to how they should do that. Many other countries have done. I looked at the other day, I hadn't done about India, but I looked at there have been recommendations for India. And after looking at all of them, I came to a conclusion, only a few things that I want to bring to your attention. One, sitting in this hall and being who you are, most important thing is education and awareness. People are to know about it, people are to be educated about it. Then what needs to be done is very, very simple thing, that you improve surveillance, you improve the mechanics, mechanisms, machinery of all that, and you need to say that industry, biosafety standards, they improve. Then existing effective efforts that are being done, capability, that also ought to be enhanced. Very important part, that robust healthcare programs ought to be undertaken, improved. This is diagnostic, quick responses to outbreaks. And the most important thing is that you do need international cooperation and collaboration. What really happens in all this setting, you probably know, is that there is the United Nations World Health Organization. At times it is criticized because it takes time, it's slow in moving. Sometimes it's criticized that it's kind of glacial speed that it moves. It's not very swift, it's bureaucratic, it has got all those problems that many bureaucratic governments with red tape are always known for, and the United Nations is not known for very swift action. Many of you probably know International Law Commission. How many of you have heard about International Law Commission? Many of you. It's again a body of the United Nations that works on, if I had asked you what do they do, you'll probably say that it is progressive development and targetification. And that International Law Commission then takes a case, an area, a topic, on it works for a long period of time. For example, it has been working on trees. It worked on rivers. It has worked on all kinds of issues pertaining to international law where they see that there is a gap. For example, state responsibility. When do you hold a state liable or responsible for some action that it has taken? And even if it is lawful, and it might have caused to another state or to the international arena some kind of adverse impact, can you hold the state responsible? It has worked in the international, environmental, international criminal, all kinds of areas. And the point simply is that just as that body, just as many other United Nations bodies are kind of slow in moving, so is this. So at the present time, most important thing would be that even if that treaty, that biological warfare treaty, toxins, germs and these bioweapons, even if that treaty is not waterproof, is inadequate in some way, but countries must adhere to it, countries must follow it, and the point is that their yearly report, it has to go into what actions they are taking to prevent it, what actions they are taking to collaborate and provide international cooperation in the field. And you know, there is a whole lot that you can go into this bio-weapons and bio-problems and how terrorism can create problems. But I think what I simply wanted to give you is a very simple look at it. And the bottom line is that it is today a very difficult area, a complex area that you can have full control over. How many of you have worked on this bio-warfare? Anybody who has done some work on it? But do look into it, because as Dr. Ahuja mentioned, Professor Ahuja mentioned, there is chemical weapons, there are nuclear issues, there is this bio and chemical and bio, these two areas, they are at times taken together. They are the ones that at the present time are creating a whole lot of problem. On the chemical weapons, you probably know, in Syria, they have been used, many countries have used them, but Syria today is unfortunately a prime example in which those are being used. On bioterrorism, there hasn't been any state action. There are probably 17, 18 states that do have at the present time the capability, and they have kept that capability at the present time in the United States, in Russia. They are in the labs, these kind of germs. And the point simply is that anytime anybody can use them, can create them, but luckily after the Second World War, there haven't been any attempts after 1972 when this treaty came into being. So I think I wanted to bring to your attention just the basic, elementary, simple facts about it, and I would be very happy to take any questions or hear any comments from you. Thank you very much. Any question, any comment? Because I've done some work on it, I'll be happy to go into any details, even technical aspects of it, but any major questions or comments, and not simply questions, but comments also. Thank you.
Very good one. Sir, few days back I was reading an article by Chinese ambassador to India. He was appealing to the Indian domestic polity in particular and South Asian regional polity. Not to stigmatize the South to contain this also, right?
Just a second. I'm just grabbing it. So that if I go quite Ji, thank you.
He was appealing to the regional residents not to stigmatize the recent outbreak in China, but to cooperate to contain this very outbreak, right? But few months back there was also a violation of convention on biotechnology and genetics. The Chinese, one of the scientists from China, he did some experiment in laboratory in vitro fertilization and regarding embryo and all, and he was trying to clone it. In fact, he outrightly came to the media and he published few journals also regarding his experiment and put forth that he had been through all these experiments, he had developed the cloning, right? So China, on the official side, China criticized this, but in its domestic law and violation of the convention, he didn't actually take any measure over this, right? So how do you look the Chinese role into domestic polity and in fact vis-a-vis the world you can say, yeah.
Very good, very good. The point is made that China perhaps the point is being made that China domestically has taken steps and actions that are not totally conducive to bringing about kind of prevention of all these. And the point also is that under international law, as in the last 3-4 days we have been talking about it, there is no international enforcement that is adequate. And so you're right, international cooperation, collaboration, we keep talking about it. But if countries are not following, not complying with international standards and are violating them, then at the present time there is no adequate machinery internationally that can take action. Because as you probably know, in the United Nations, only the Security Council can act. And on the Security Council sit those 5 countries with their veto power, and they can block any action. So the only action by the Security Council and all these 5 countries able to block every one of those actions, and China being one of them. So in practice, you can talk about theory, you can talk about all these high-floating kind of words. And you can be very sure that on paper and in theory, you have produced a watertight kind of arrangement. But in practice, it's not there. So I think you're right about it. I think that there is no way that you can compel China to do things. But the only thing that you can do is peer pressure. And that peer pressure is from other countries. And those countries are the ones that can at least put that kind of pressure on China. China on SARS was not communicative at all. Today it is transparent to some extent, but not totally.
I'll just add something to it. See, there are 2 things. One is about the invention which are being done with respect to biotechnology and cloning, which you are talking about. That is being done everywhere. In America is far ahead of time. The moment your activities are such which may have the potential of spreading disease, and not only to your country but to neighboring countries and other places also, as it happened in this particular case, then it becomes a matter of concern for the entire international community. Fine. So doing research with respect to biotechnology and cloning and other things, that is permissible, that is happening everywhere. But this kind of experiment, if it was an experiment, where the virus has been spread and it goes to different countries, it becomes an epidemic and pandemic later on, then of course it becomes a matter of concern for the entire Indonesian community. Thank you.
Good afternoon, sir. So technology is a double-edged sword. Now, gene editing and creation of new viruses, and looking at the response, how human body responds to it, how the immune system evolves, and how it can be improved. This is also essential to prevent any such epidemic happening on its own, which can happen naturally also. What is the international stance of the international community, whether such research should be encouraged or it should be curbed completely in order to prevent accidental release of such viruses? I believe it should encourage such research, but with stringent requirements for safety and precautions required so as to prevent accidental spread of these viruses. What is the real situation?
What's happening is that as they sit and talk, and these are the review conferences, they have been trying to do exactly what you are saying. That they are trying to see that they don't spread, that there are precautions that can be taken. And I think the coming review conference, it's going to be 2020, and it's going to be in Geneva. And I think 2021. It's going to be in Geneva, and that's where at the present time I'm sure that the issues that you have raised again will come up, because internationally there have to be efforts taken and are not at the present time adequate. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
So thank you, sir. Just connected to all the debates that you are doing here, can we discuss anything like state responsibility? Where there are so many critical researchers who thinking that when you do not perform it in a better manner with proper safeguard, it is bound to leak, bound to cause widespread harm. Its effect may be global. All other countries' citizens are also affected. Citizens of other countries also may lose their lives. So could we think something on state responsibility sort of things? Can we say that state responsibility may increase? Okay, even not in this case. Like there is chances that suppose like biological weapon experimentation can amount to use of force against war or may amount to aggression if you do not perform the experiments as per the proper safeguard. And so can we think of on those lines to fix the states as per state responsibility or against threat to peace and security, all these things. Thank you.
Very good. On International Law Commission has done a whole lot of work on state responsibility. Anyone who has read anything on the International Law Commission and state responsibility, I'm going to ask you to kindly do that, because we have done that, and as you probably know, it still is pretty imperfect. It's not very perfect, and at the same time, not only that, but there is no enforcement. And if there is no enforcement, and you simply have got some rules, in the future, they will become operative. But at the present time, unfortunately, even on that state responsibility, and it has gone both. Even lawful actions, not simply that you are doing unlawful actions, but even in lawful actions, if there is adverse impact, then they would like to have state being held responsible. Now you hold the state responsible, but what do you do with it? How do you enforce it? What kind of sanctions can you take? And on that one, as you probably know, we are still in a setting where each state, with its own sovereignty and with its own demands, that all that it can do is on its own terms. That stands for it. Apeli, you had something? Yeah.
I just,
Yes.
Yes, please.
so I just wanted to add to that. I have also a question related to the Customary International. Do you think that there is a possibility of crystallization of Customary International law against biological warfare? Because there is a talk on this to be included in weapons of mass destruction. So in future or at the moment, do you sense that there is a possibility?
I think it may be in the future, but at the present time, this treaty has now led to the evolution of customary international law. Because again, as you know, in customary international law, you have to see state practice, you have to see a pretty much jurists, and at this stage there isn't. But I think the point simply would be that it should and it ought to become kind of customary international law to see that these states that are violating and states that are doing process that are just said, obviously there are almost all states doing that biotechnology, cloning, all that, but then violations ought to be sanctioned.
Because that question is actually important because we have a growing jurisprudence, international jurisprudence regarding the chemical weapons.
Yeah.
You see that any state resorting to use of chemical weapons can be bombarded by a coalition of international forces.
Well, who did anything?
I mean, in the case of Syria,
In the case of Syria, what happened?
the mustard gases were used, banned chemical weapons, because right from World War I we have been seeing a growing kind of clamor for banning chemical weapons. So that's just an observation. I mean, do you really believe that this is the requirement of the treaty, that the states come together and ban this biological warfare because this is to be treated as a weapon of mass destruction?
Absolutely, I agree with you. But remember, on Syria, nothing happened. Even Obama, who said there is going to be a red line, he didn't do anything. International community has not done anything. And they have repeatedly violated the Chemical Weapons Convention.
Thanks.
Sir, we have two words. One word is prevention, other word is regulation. And these two words many times interplay to regulate the regime of welfare. So I just want to know about your own observation. What is the threshold to understand prevention and regulation of weapons in the warfare?
My observation, as probably yours would be, that in each state there is a clamor from the civil society that that state does not violate the law and complies with all those strict and stringent conditions put on it. And that how that happens will depend upon how robust the civil society is and how robust there can be an effort within the country to compel decision makers in those countries to comply with them. That at the present time is the only answer. I think in the days to come, we might have international action that can be successful. If there is an international action, unfortunately at the present time, that international action is going to be peer pressure. That international action is going to be that the state itself considers it in its own interest in order to comply with that.
So can we say that the prevention and regulation is very much power-centric? Because since you have already mentioned that these weapons are very easy to access, but when it comes to nuclear weapon which is legal to use, it's very difficult to get access. And nation state needs to have something called self-defense. Self-defense is not a word of art; it is a real term. Everybody needs to have some sense of weapons so that there can be self-preservation. So I think, can we say that it's like more power-centric? And if we accept that it is power-centric, then international law goes towards realism rather than idealism.
Well, you know, international law is not a panacea. And international law does not operate in a vacuum. As an international lawyer, I wish that it could just be applied just as a statute applies, or as a charter applies, but as constitutional provision applies to all of us. And at the present time, it is not in that setting. A nation state has got to feel that it's in its own interest that it complies with international law. And I hope the day can come when you and I as international lawyers feel that international law is robust enough that it can apply not simply in a horizontal but in a vertical fashion. आखिरी सवाल पूछिए, 1 बज गया.
Good afternoon, sir. As you talked about in 1925 General Protocol for the prohibition of the use and work of defecating poisonous gases as an illegitimate means of waging war. So my question is, what are the provisional procedures taken up or recommended by experts or consultants in this regard, because the enforcement of the protocol is hindered by the lack of investigating mechanisms to provide prompt and effective verification of an any violation?
I think again, as you mentioned, and I'm sorry, I hope that I got the question right, the enforcement mechanism, is that what you're talking?
Yes.
And unfortunately, again, the point is that enforcement, all of us are impatient, and we should be. All of us want enforcement to be watertight, and it isn't. And I think that is what you and I feel as international lawyers, that we are, on the one hand, optimists because we want to see that there is rule of law. We want to see that there is international practice commensurate with all those standards that we have set. You and I also want to know that although we have all these wonderful norms, is there implementation? Is there enforcement? And I think that day, I hope that with your efforts, with the efforts of all young people who are at the present time in civil society, playing an important role, that in the days to come, we can make it a reality. So let's hope so. We'll do it. Thank you.
Good afternoon.
Yeah.
Honorable Professor, Honorable Professor in charge and Director Program. I just wanted to add a line or two regarding the topic today.
Please.
International law basically is based on reciprocity, and we have to talk about that Security Council is the only enforcing mechanism. And what happens is, in international law, as I said, is based on reciprocity. So, to prevent such problems as biological weapons or weapons of mass destruction, we need to focus on principles which unite us more than dividing. For instance, the basic uniting factor could be we all inhale oxygen, drink water, eat food, and everybody needs honor. You give me honor, I give you honor. We treat each other with respect. So why can't these things be inculcated in our statutory laws of international or domestic laws, for instance? So I just wanted to add this comment to the lecture. Thank you very much for the enlightenment.
Thank you very much. Do you want to say something? No. I simply want you to know that I'm deeply grateful to you. I wish you all to succeed. I wish that you have wonderful careers. And I want you to know that fortunately for you, yesterday, Europe campaign stopped. In the United States, they never do. So wish that in the United States also, these campaigns do not keep going on and on and on. And I'm delighted to be with you, and I'll see you next year. Thank you.
One comment from my side also. I just want to supplement that. When we were talking about the weapons of biological warfare, it's not something which is new. That used to happen long back when the technology was not advanced. What used to happen was that when the fight was going on between the two countries, so what they do, one side of the one state, the army of one state, then kill the animals, and when their bodies start rotting, then put those bodies in the river from where the enemy army was drinking water. So if you just go back into the history, so they used to drink water from the river only. So then put those animals, the dead bodies of those animals at a point, from where the water was flowing, so that the entire water was contaminated, and it was being done in such a manner that remains top secret. And whenever they were drinking water, their stomach was upset, they start vomiting, they were not in a position to fight. So this is not that it is happening now. Now the things have become very advanced. So it used to happen in the previous time also, long back in the history. If you just read some old literature, you will find these kind of examples. Sir, when you were talking about International Law Commission, so I just tell you, sir, that the member of the International Law Commission, Mr. Anirudh Raju, a year back he was here with us. He delivered a lecture on progressive development and the codification of international law. And one more thing, when we were talking about the responsibility, state responsibility, sir, we have a compulsory module of state responsibility in the paper on topic international law in the first year itself. So we are just telling them about the draft rules, on the state responsibility. Law Center is humbled with the benign presence of Honorable Professor V.P. Nanda. I'm extremely thankful on behalf of Law Center to the faculty member, the students, and the staff that you accepted our invitation, and you came right from University of Denver to spend a week with us. When I was sitting in the sir's chamber, he was so humble. He asked me one question: "What can I do for you?" I mean, for us means for the entire faculty, for the student, for the teachers, and for the entire. So my only request to him was that, sir, please help us to get our papers published in the international journal. Please guide us on research, because that is one area where I would like my students and the teachers to work on. And he was so kind, he accepted that. He said, if you people are working hard, you send your papers, you send your research papers, and I'll provide you all sort of help. I'll cooperate, and I'll just see to it that your papers are published in the international journal in the United States. So I think this is a very good opportunity for all of you, because teacher, Professor Ashutosh Acharya, he has approached me and he said that there are a lot of students who are interested in writing blogs. So that is a good thing if you are doing that. I know that you have that kind of a potential. But then, keep on doing a qualitative research. Because as Professor Nanda used to tell us that if I have to deliver a lecture on something, I would try to read each and everything, which I get on that particular topic, and then only I deliver my lecture. Every day, before coming to this particular moot court hall, he'll sit in his chamber, he'll come, I think 2 hours before his schedule, and then he'll start preparing that. So we keep on disturbing him in between, but otherwise he was focused, and you can see that he is still carrying the papers, the notes, which he has prepared. And it is all because of this kind of habit which you develop, where you make a lot of studies before going to the class, that makes a person a good teacher, a good researcher. Sir, you are really a source of inspiration for all of us, and we have been observing you very closely. Not only that, we were listening to you very patiently and taking advantage of your wisdom, but at the same time, we were also looking at the way you prepare lecture, the way you fulfill your commitments also. Friends, I'll give you one example about this commitment. As you are aware that Mr. Trump, he was going to be impeached. This impeachment trial was going on in Senate day before yesterday. Professor, he got up early in the morning, in the midnight at 2 a.m. just to see what was happening in his country. And after seeing all those things, that he was acquitted, that he went to bed again at 4:30 a.m. in the morning. That is a kind of commitment, He's here from America, but then he is keeping himself updated about the developments, about the news which are taking place in the United States. Friends, the kind of commitment which he has shown has resulted into some very important things. Like, for example, he told us that his students have created a Professor V.P. Nanda Center in the University of Delhi. A chair has been created in his name, Professor V.P. Nanda chair, which normally, as he rightly pointed out, when a person, a non-academician, dies. So after his death, normally these kind of chairs are being or centers are being instituted in his memory. But that is not the case with him. And the most important aspect was that he was telling us how the funding started. So the student, one of our students, he put $1 million, in the account which was opened for that center. There were others also who started putting money into that. So I hope he might be having a very good purpose at the moment to run that Professor V.P. Nanda Center. Now this is what is the achievement of a professor, and it all comes when you are showing a lot of commitments, you do a lot of hard work, and recently he has been awarded with the Good Professor Award. What exactly is that, sir?
I'm sorry.
What award has been given to you right now?
I'm very honored that the university has launched a new medal. When the university was founded about 130 years ago, and this year they have started a new medal, and it's the Faculty Founders Day Medal. And I'm the first recipient of that medal in Nigeria.
And another thing is, as you know, last year, sir has been conferred with Padma Bhushan Award. So friends, please take him as your ideal, consider him as a source of inspiration, show the commitment as he has shown, and I'm sure that you are going to have a very, very successful life. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for coming.
So we would like to felicitate you with token of our appreciation. I would like to call upon Dr. P. Sharma and Professor Ahuja to kindly felicitate Sir with the token of our gratitude.
Thank you very much. I'm deeply honored and look forward to seeing you. Beautiful. And I share it with all of you. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you everyone for being here.
And thanks very much for coming.